Hello, and welcome to this week's preview for our study of the book of Isaiah. And today's our last day looking at Isaiah because we're covering the last four chapters. We're going to be talking about endings in our introduction. Before we get there, I'm going to show you this picture that's based off Isaiah 64, the first couple of verses there, which we'll talk about today. A lot of the artwork I've been using the course of the study is from a website called fullofeyes.com. There's an artist there who takes vivid imagery from scripture and tries to portray it in art, and I really like this one. In Isaiah 64, prophet is speaking to God and saying, God, rend the heavens and come down, and uses all this powerful imagery of what he wants God to do. And here's this picture of God rending the heavens coming down. But what does he come down to do? He comes down to die on the cross. So, as we said, we're talking about endings today, the introduction, what makes for an enjoyable ending to a movie or a book. That's a very subjective question. You might have lots of different opinions out there about what makes for a good ending or a good book. So, do you like it all nice and wrapped up? Is that your preference? Or are you someone who wants to watch the Death Star explode at the end of Star Wars, the first one, or Return of the Jedi? Do you like it when the Disney princess and the Disney prince get married at the end of Little Mermaid, and you think that ties it up really well? Or are you a fan of those books or movies that end sort of open ending and they don't really give you an indication of how the story wraps up or not, and leave you to fill in the blanks yourself, or leave you guessing a little bit, or maybe there's some twist at the ending? That's up to you. But the way that God ends Isaiah is beautiful and graphic. There's the way that the book of Isaiah ends. Those last four chapters have some tough things in there, as we've encountered over the course of this study, some tough things from God saying to an obstinate people. But what we find here, especially in the new heaven and the new earth at the end of chapter 65, gives us tons of hope as we work through a world that can feel pretty messed up at times. So our objectives for this lesson are simple: appreciate the manner in which God ends a difficult and beautiful book. And then second, marvel one last time at the law-gospel balance in Isaiah. I thought that was so clear in our lesson last time. Just some beautiful imagery. Though I was angry at you, turn away from my anger. Though I was enraged at your actions, I saw what you did, but still I'm going to heal you. And that is very prominent in this lesson too. Before we get to the text itself, I'll just mention this. So in Isaiah 49, 52, 53, we were introduced to this suffering servant whom we know as Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And we realize that much of the Messiah's work is going to be brutal for him, that it's going to be this slog of suffering and rejection and just this man of sorrows. Right before our text starts at the beginning of chapter 63, that same suffering servant is now walking with a robe that looks like it's been dipped in wine. Isaiah says it's like he's been treading grapes, but it's not wine, it's blood. So this suffering servant is now the victorious servant who is conquering his enemies. So as we introduce this last section of the book of Isaiah, we have this man who's no longer at the mercy of these people who are torturing him or rejecting him. Now he comes as conquering warrior. So that really gives us the tone for these last four chapters. God is in charge. Just one thought on the overarching structure of these last four chapters. Basically, in 63 and 64, you have God, or I should say, you have Isaiah making one final plea to God, and he's really vocalizing a lot of what Israel is feeling. God, come down and help us. So that's 63 and 64. And 65 and 66 is God's answer, as he's basically saying, here's what I'm going to do, here's what I'm not going to do. So you see in the chapter headings or the section headings, I have 63 and 64 all begin with Isaiah's prayer. 65 and 66 begin with God's answer. So the first part of Isaiah's prayer, it's really Israel asking God to, again, come down and help. And part of the basis for their plea is, God, you've been like this throughout history. They reference, right? I don't know what number time it is in the book of Isaiah, but they reference the parting of the Red Sea. And God, you're the God that did that. When our ancestors needed you, when they were backed up against the Red Sea and about to die, do you remember what you did? You came down, you heard their cries for help, you parted the Red Sea and brought them through. So they're kind of calling on God to remember what he has done and say, oops, we're going the wrong way here, and say, I'm going to take care of you now. That first activity there, number one, we sometimes use the acronym ACTS for balanced prayers. So I thought that would be good for that first activity, is to look through this first section of Isaiah's prayer and kind of determine, is this a balanced prayer from Isaiah? Do you see God being adored? Is there a confession of guilt and sin? Is there thanksgiving for who God is? And then is there supplication? Is God being asked to do something? And you should be able to find all four of those. Moving on to the second page of the study, Isaiah's prayer, we messed up. That's a short section that I have there for you, just 3 verses, but it's interesting to me, this mixture of regret and confidence that Isaiah is voicing on Israel's behalf, which is an interesting combo. You think normally when you regret something, you maybe would be a little hesitant to ask the person that you'd offended to help you, to give you something. And here yet, Isaiah and Israel are expressing regret about mistakes they've made, and yet they're very confident asking God for something. So think about that mix, and do we have that mix as sinner saints, as Christians? Is there a regret and yet also a confidence in approaching God? Chapter 64, Isaiah's prayer, please come down here. That has some sections that you probably know well. Just in terms of law and gospel, we probably have talked about them in sermons or Bible studies. You've heard it before. All our righteous acts are like filthy rags. Isaiah says, because of our sin, we shrivel up like a leaf and we're kind of blown around. So there is that acknowledgement from Isaiah and the people that we're nothing. We can't make you do this, God. We don't deserve you coming down here to do it. We're just going to lay ourselves bare before you. Every good thing that we would try to do, it's rubbish. It's garbage. We are helpless and we need you. And there's also that very familiar picture of God is the potter and we are the clay. So there's an acknowledgement to God. If we're going to be okay, God, you have to do it. And we know you don't need to do it. We don't deserve you doing it, but yet we're asking you anyway. Will you please help us? And then God's answer in the next few sections in Isaiah 65, 1-9. You don't deserve it, but here's what I'm going to do for you. So you look at those 9 verses and pay attention to how many of them are God just saying, you've really screwed up. You're right, people. You are the clay, and bad clay at that. You are shriveled up, dying leaves. And then just there's like 2 sections in there, those 9 verses where God says, but here's what I'm going to do. And I use as a picture of grapes, the image of a cluster of grapes that you look at it first glance and it looks bad. There's nothing we can use these grapes for. But you take a closer look and you realize, okay, there's still a little juice left in here. There's something, we're not going to throw this all out because we could still squeeze a little bit of grape juice out of here and make wine or drink the juice. And so God is saying, I'm not going to toss aside my chosen people. There's still a little bit left in here, so I will preserve a remnant. God's answer, new heavens and a new earth. I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson. That's an amazing section. It starts with, I will create new heavens and a new earth. Something to note here. We've said before that sometimes when the prophets talk, they have several different time periods kind of smushed into one. Months ago, we talked about that mountain range picture, that when you're approaching a mountain range, the whole mountain range looks like it's one long string of mountains, straight in front of you. But then as you get closer to the mountain range, you see some of it's closer, some of it's further away. And you're driving through something like the Rocky Mountains, and you realize, oh no, there's peaks and there's valleys and things like that. So Isaiah in this section 65, 17-25 is seeing wonderful things, but some of it's the New Testament church, starting with the apostles. Some of it's us today, and some of it's the new heaven and the new earth. So maybe just something to know as you go through the section. 17 to 19 really seem to be about heaven. And then 20 through probably 24, 25 probably too, are really talking about the New Testament when Jesus comes. So you have, starting off, new heavens and a new earth. That's Judgment Day. But Isaiah is also including some comfort for us before that day in terms of what God is going to bring to the world through the gospel and the peace that will bring. All right, I'm on the back page now. God's answer, both peace and fire. This is another one, that second objective. Appreciate how God balances law and gospel. This is another section here. The number 7, the activity there, references verse 12. It says, I will extend peace to Israel like a river And then it also, a couple verses later in verse 14, God is coming in fire. He's coming in a whirlwind. So how can you justify both of those things? God extending peace like a river, but also coming in fire. And why do we need a God like that, who can be so gentle and compassionate, forgiving, and yet also, when we need him to be, is this God of fire and destruction and rescue? So think about that a little bit. Then we come to the end. The last section, Isaiah 66:22-24. This is the very end of the book, and it's talking about the aftermath of Judgment Day. And for a book that has had beautiful promises in it, if you're going to look at the book of Isaiah and figure out, is it more promise or is it more warning from God? You'd have to say it is more warning from God, and it ends accordingly. That last verse is talking about after Judgment Day, and those in God's kingdom will go out and look on the dead bodies of those who rebelled against me. The worms that eat them will not die. The fire that burns them will not be quenched, and they will be loathsome to all mankind. That is a graphic and difficult way to end this book. So why does God do that? Why does God end this beautiful book with such a strong warning? So think about that, and we'll talk about that at the end of our study, either on Sunday or if you join us on Thursday. And just to finish our video today, and to finish our walk through Isaiah with this image, from the one we talked about at the beginning. Isaiah prays on behalf of Israel in 64, God, that you would rend the heavens and come down and do something, come down and help. And God says, I will. And then here's how I'm going to help. I'm going to rend the heavens and come down to die for you. And I like this picture too, because you've got the centurion that watched Jesus die. And after Jesus gave up his last breath, do you remember what that centurion said? Surely this man was the Son of God. So God did come down and do something. And what he did was suffer and die in our place. And he did that in a way that one of the centurions putting him to death could look at it and recognize this guy was who he said he was. He was that promised Messiah. Okay, looking forward to covering these last four chapters with you. I pray that these videos have been a blessing to you as we walk through an amazing book of the Bible, Isaiah. It has a lot of challenges, but a lot of beautiful, beautiful promises. God bless your study.